Welcome to this episode of Rattling the Bars. For over 60 years, the United States has effectively jailed Cuba through political intervention and economical warfare. Recently, the Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization, that is Pastors for Peace, held a virtual gathering with Cuban official Alejandro Garcia, second head of the Cuban diplomatic mission in Washington, D.C., concerning the U.S. blockade of Cuba and discussing Cuba's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Cuba is on the front burner, and our responsibility as Cuba's friends is to push back against the unjust attacks on the island, to lift up, Cuba and its reality. The claims that are out there, besides the social media, the recent social media attacks, the claims that Cuba is a failed state, that it's denying its people human rights, that it's treating its doctors as slaves, and of course the abuse of social media to attack Cuba.
Before Trump left office, he placed Cuba back on the U.S. list of state sponsors of terrorism, leading to additional sanctions being applied to Cuba. Since taking office, Biden has failed to lift that sanction, and in fact, he has added additional sanctions against Cuba.
The combination of more than 243 measures and sanctions set by the Trump administrations, which have not changed in 1 millimeter during the Biden administration, and at the same moment with the COVID-19 pandemic hurting the Cuban economy, the Cuban tourism, and the Cuban daily life of our people.
The executive director of IFCO, Gail Walker, has measured the economic and human costs of the sanctions and blockades against Cuba.
The shameful truth is that the U.S. policy toward Cuba is not an international issue, as many of us know. It's a domestic issue where politicians circulate the same lies so that they can win Cuban American votes in the state of Florida, particularly, pandering to people like Miami Mayor Francis Suarez, who recently called for exploring airstrikes and military intervention against Cuba.
Are you suggesting airstrikes in Cuba?
What I'm suggesting is that option is one that has to be explored and cannot be just simply discarded as an option that is not on the table. And there's a variety of ways the military can do it, but that's something that needs to be discussed and needs to be looked at as a potential option in addition to a variety of other options.
Both the Cuban government and the United Nations have estimated that the blockade has cost $130 billion with the B dollars over the past 6 decades. And it's worth noting that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce estimates that the blockade costs the U.S. economy billions of dollars each year as well. The human toll is harder to quantify, but it's clearly been significant. Human rights experts at the United Nations have called on the U.S. to ease its sanctions against COVID-19 pandemic, and arguing that such a change would save lives.
Despite the blockade, compared to countries like the U.S., Cuba has been successfully fighting COVID-19, keeping deaths and cases relatively low. Diplomat Garcia explained that this healthcare system that's saving lives now came out of the Cuban Revolution.
We have been capable to obtain or to create 3 different vaccines and 2 vaccine candidates under these conditions. And that has been possible because of the effort that was made by Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro almost 40 years ago on creating the biotechnology industry in Cuba. Despite of the blockade of the US, the Cuban scientists and the Cuban doctor have been capable to obtain those 3 vaccines, and at the same time to continue working on 2 other candidates for the disease, and even to obtain many different treatments and many different pills and other procedures to combat and trying to decrease the level of the death rate of the COVID-19 in our country.
Another panelist, Samira Addrey, organizer for IFCO, spoke on the United States abandonment during times of natural disasters and other social crises like the current COVID-19 pandemic, and the many times that Cuba has stepped in to provide medical assistance and basic necessities to impacted populations.
When Haiti was struck with an earthquake, Cuba was there and never left. When Katrina happened here, Cuba was ready, but our own government refused its help. And we continue to see the negligence of leaders entrusted with the protection of our people. Today, the trending topic is vaccines, while for over 3 decades, Cuba has been fortifying its biotechnological sector to be able to produce 8 of the 11 vaccines used in the national vaccination program. Cuba is surging forward in production of vaccines against COVID-19 to save its population, as well as other countries who have been grossly overlooked in the race to own the vaccine and to make profits from it. Today, Cuba is the first country in the world, as you've heard, to vaccinate children from ages 2 to 18 to secure a safe educational environment before resuming in-person classes. Children and parents willingly consent to these vaccines because there is a culture of scientific acceptance and guidance in Cuba. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is plagued with questions about our children's health and safety, with already having returned to in-person instruction.
One of the myths that the U.S. State Department circulates is labeling the Cuban medical internationalism as an effort to enslave and influence other countries and engage in human trafficking. However, this claim is disputed by doctors who are part of the program.
The U.S. and its friends, its allies, would call the Cuban work of medical workers in the world as enslavement. Doctora Marisnelli Echemendia Concepcion eloquently stated, "We Cuban medical graduates take on an international commitment that remains and goes with us wherever we are needed. After all, a doctor is only a slave to his or her calling as a humanist."
During the question and answer session, Diplomat Garcia spoke of Cuba's cultural acceptance and normalization of the vaccine mandate.
When you assess the Cuban reality, you will see that there is a high level of culture in Cuba. There is a high level of culture even in the health, for the health issues. People are well prepared on all these efforts about the state goal to vaccinate people, to vaccinate the kids just after the delivery by the mothers. You are taking 3, 4, 5 different shots for different vaccines in your next 6 months, in your next 11 months. So there is a culture about getting vaccinations in Cuba. Could be few people that will not take the vaccination of COVID or any other vaccines, but it's connecting more to some belief on some religious basis, but not a general or a public a feeling on denying the vaccination. And that's very important because it helps a lot the state to control any disease, including the COVID-19 now. We are starting to see some declining on the deaths of an amount of death in the population. And we hope that in the next 4 and 6 weeks, we could be seeing more decreasing on the number of cases about COVID-19. The disinformation campaign about Cuba is not limited to the shortage of medicine or foods. It's not limited to amplify the protests on 11 July. Even in the issue of the vaccinations and vaccines, 2 weeks ago, we heard a misinformation effort by a very big media company here in the US about the non-validation of the Cuban vaccines by the World Health Organization. And that happened in the midst of a very big spread of good news about the Cuban vaccines.
One of the restrictions of the U.S. blockade of Cuba has been the limitation of travel from the U.S. to Cuba. This gives a narrow vision of what life is like on the island, how the government provides housing for its people, or the many success stories of its healthcare system. Still, the main reason why the U.S. has not lifted the blockade is that the communist revolution symbolizes a threat to its capitalist economy.
It's clear that the real intention of the US is to destroy the revolution, and for that reason, people like in the extreme right groups don't want to reinstate the travel right to the American to go to Cuba, because they know that if the millions of Americans go to Cuba, they will see the reality. And the reality is much, much different than what they picture in the US media. So and you can see, and those folks have never gone to Cuba. Marco Rubio has never gone to Cuba. Ted Cruz, Bob Menendez, they know nothing about the Cuban reality. Mm-hmm. But their goal is to keep the American citizens far away from visiting Cuba and from more connection with Cuba.
The panelists discuss Guantanamo Bay Prison, a prison that's notorious for its horrific conditions and human rights abuses. The Biden administration has gone on record stating that it would close the prison by the end of his term, and the issue has been gaining more and more publicity.
I don't have a timeline for you. As you know, there's a process. There are different layers of the process, but that remains our goal, and we are considering all available avenues to responsibly transfer detainees and, of course, close Guantanamo Bay.
There are currently 39 prisoners incarcerated at Guantanamo Bay. It costs us $13 million for each prisoner.
Every year since 92, the UN General Assembly has voted on a resolution to end the U.S. blockade, and we've had, under the leadership of Councillor Bruno Rodriguez, saying year after year, stating the hypocrisy of these policies, and citing one of these prime examples being Guantanamo Bay Prison and its torture tactics utilized to this day. So it's a question that is very important, and it's a question that should bring to the forefront of our minds that, unfortunately, what our government chooses to deal in says a lot to its own terrorist activities.
We will continue to bring you further updates regarding the relations of the U.S. to Cuba. Thank you for joining this episode of Rattling the Bars.